Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about tea. Just tea. A simple drink made from leaves and hot water. And yet, somehow, it became the most consumed beverage on the entire planet, second only to water itself. Over 5,000 years of history live inside a single cup. We're going to take our time with all of it. So get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket up a little higher, and let's begin at the very beginning. The story of tea begins, like many great stories, with an accident. The year, according to legend, is approximately 2737 BCE. The place is ancient China. The man is Shennong, the divine farmer, a mythical emperor who is said to have introduced the Chinese people to agriculture and herbal medicine. He was a careful man, they say, a scientific man in his own ancient way. He had a rule. He would boil all his water before drinking it because he believed this kept the body healthy. One afternoon, Shennong was resting beneath a wild tree. His servants had set water to boil nearby. A gentle breeze moved through the branches above him, and then, quietly, a few leaves drifted down from the tree, a Camellia sinensis tree, as it happens, and fell softly into the boiling pot. Shennong noticed the water slowly changing color. It turned a soft, warm amber. Curious, he lifted the cup and drank. He found it refreshing, slightly bitter, energizing in a quiet way. That tree was the tea plant. That cup was, according to legend, the very first cup of tea ever drunk. Now, historians are careful to note that this is a myth, a beautiful origin story, not a documented fact, but myths carry truth inside them. What is certain is this. By around 3000 BCE, the people of the Yunnan province in southwest China were already using tea leaves not as a drink, but as food, chewing the raw leaves for their stimulating effect, or cooking them with other ingredients into a kind of medicinal paste. Tea, in those early days, was medicine before it was a beverage. For many centuries, tea remained primarily in the world of medicine and ritual. It was boiled into thick soups, it was pressed into cakes and traded as currency in border regions. But something began to shift during the Tang dynasty, which lasted from 206 BCE to 220 CE. Tea began appearing in written records. References to tea buying and selling appear in texts from this era. A contract written on a wooden tablet from the early Han period describes a servant being sent to buy tea, making it one of the earliest written records of tea as a commercial product. By the time the Tang dynasty arrived in 618 CE, tea had transformed completely. It was no longer just medicine, it had become a cultural institution. The Tang dynasty is often called the Golden Age of tea in China. It was during this era that a man named Lu Yu wrote a book that would change the world of tea forever. The book was called Cha Jing, the classic of tea. Written around 760 CE, it was a comprehensive, almost obsessive study of everything related to tea: how to grow it, how to pick it, how to prepare it, how to drink it, and even what kind of water to use. Lu Yu described 24 pieces of equipment needed to make tea properly. He distinguished between good water and bad water. He explained that mountain spring water was best, river water was acceptable, and well water was to be avoided if possible. He wrote with a kind of quiet reverence for the process, as if preparing tea were itself a form of prayer. In Tang Dynasty China, tea was typically compressed into bricks or cakes, broken off in pieces, ground into powder, and whisked with hot water into a frothy drink. This was not the loose-leaf brewing most people know today. That would come later. Tea houses began to appear across Chinese cities. Emperors drank tea, poets wrote about tea, and merchants began to carry it, carefully packed, along the ancient trade routes that connected China to the rest of Asia. Tea arrived in Japan through Buddhist monks who traveled between China and Japan carrying many things with them: scrolls, seeds, ideas, and tea. The earliest written record of tea in Japan dates to 815 CE, when the monk Eichu offered tea to the Emperor Saga, who reportedly enjoyed it greatly and ordered tea plants to be cultivated near the imperial court in Kyoto. But it was in the 12th century that tea truly took root in Japan. The monk Isai, who had traveled to China and studied there, brought back not just tea seeds, but the Song dynasty method of preparing powdered tea called matcha. He planted tea seeds in the grounds of Kyoto's Kozanji Temple. He also wrote a book called Kisa Yojoki, Drinking Tea for Health, in which he argued that tea was a miraculous medicine for maintaining health. Over the following centuries, tea culture in Japan developed its own entirely distinct character. While China moved toward loose-leaf brewing, Japan refined and elevated the whisked powdered tea into something almost spiritual. This culminated in chado, the way of tea, also known as the Japanese tea ceremony. The ceremony was shaped by Zen Buddhist philosophy. Every gesture, every movement, every object in the room carried meaning. The tea room itself was designed to strip away the noise of the world and leave only silence, simplicity, and presence. The great tea master Sen no Rikyu, who lived from 1522 to 1591, is considered the most influential figure in the history of the Japanese tea ceremony. He established the four principles at the heart of chado: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. He believed that every tea gathering should be treated as if it would never happen again, a concept called ichigo ichie, meaning one time, one meeting. Sen no Rikyu's influence was so great, and his relationship with the ruling warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi so complicated, that Hideyoshi eventually ordered him to commit ritual suicide. Even in death, his philosophy survived and spread. Today, the Japanese tea ceremony is still practiced in its traditional form, and matcha, his powdered green tea, has become one of the most popular tea varieties in the world. Part 4. Tea Meets the World: The Silk Road and Beyond. While Japan was developing its own tea culture, tea was also moving westward, slowly, in compressed bricks, along the ancient trade routes of Central Asia. The Tea Horse Road, known in Chinese as the Chama Dao, was one of the oldest and most important trade routes in Asia. Along this winding mountain path, traders from Yunnan carried bricks of compressed tea north and west, exchanging them for horses from Tibet and Mongolia. Tea was so valuable in these high-altitude regions that a brick of compressed tea could buy an entire horse. Tibetan tea culture developed its own character. Tea was mixed with yak butter and salt and churned into a thick, caloric drink that helped people survive the brutal cold of the Himalayan plateau. To this day, buttered tea is still drunk across Tibet and parts of Nepal and Bhutan. Farther west, tea slowly made its way into the Islamic world and into the Middle East. Persian, Arab, and Turkish traders encountered tea along the Silk Road. In Turkey, tea, chai, would eventually become the national drink, consumed in tiny tulip-shaped glasses at every hour of the day. But that full adoption would come later, in the 19th and 20th centuries. The true turning point in tea's global spread came with European exploration. Portuguese traders arrived in China in the early 15th century and encountered tea there. They brought small amounts back to Europe, mostly as a curiosity. The Dutch, who established stronger trading networks in Asia through the Dutch East India Company, began importing tea to Europe more regularly in the early 16th century,
Around 1610 is the commonly cited date for the first large shipment of tea to reach Europe. At first, tea was extraordinarily expensive in Europe. It was sold in pharmacies, advertised as a cure for headaches, colds, and many other ailments, echoing its original identity in China as medicine. Only the very wealthy could afford regularly. But then came England.
The relationship between England and tea is one of the most consequential partnerships in modern history. Tea arrived in England in the 1650s. The first advertisement for tea in an English newspaper appeared in 1658, describing it as that excellent and by all physicians approved China drink. Coffee houses had already taken hold in London by this time, and tea was added to the menu alongside coffee and chocolate. The decisive moment came in 1662, when King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Catherine was already a devoted tea drinker, as many Portuguese aristocrats were. She brought her tea-drinking habits with her to the English court, and almost immediately tea became fashionable among the English aristocracy. What the queen drinks, the court drinks. What the court drinks, the wealthy try to drink. And so tea began its long journey down through English society. By the early 18th century, the British East India Company had established itself as the dominant force in the tea trade. Tea was imported from China in enormous quantities. The volumes were staggering. By the mid-1700s, Britain was importing millions of pounds of tea per year. But tea was heavily taxed. In fact, it was taxed so heavily that a thriving black market in smuggled tea developed. At its peak, historians estimate that more than half the tea consumed in Britain had been smuggled in illegally, avoiding the customs taxes entirely. It was not until Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger slashed the tea tax in 1784 from 119% down to just 12.5% that the smuggling trade finally collapsed. Around this time, one of the most important rituals in British cultural life was quietly being invented: afternoon tea. The story goes that Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, began requesting that tea and small snacks be brought to her in the afternoon, around 1840, as a way to bridge the long gap between an early lunch and a late dinner. She began inviting friends to join her. The custom spread. Within a generation, afternoon tea had become a firmly established British institution. Meanwhile, Britain had a problem. All of its tea came from China, and the Chinese were not particularly interested in the manufactured goods Britain had to offer. The trade was deeply unbalanced. Britain was spending enormous quantities of silver to pay for tea and getting very little in return. The British East India Company's solution to this imbalance was opium. They began growing opium in their Indian territories, particularly in Bengal, and selling it in China. The trade worked financially, but it caused immense suffering and social devastation in China. When the Chinese government attempted to stop the opium trade and seized and destroyed a large cache of opium belonging to British merchants, Britain went to war. The Opium Wars, the first one from 1839 to 1842, the second from 1856 to 1860, resulted in China being forced to open its ports to foreign trade and cede Hong Kong to Britain. They are among the most painful episodes in modern Chinese history, and they were driven in no small part by the economics of tea. Part 6. India and Assam. Britain grows its own. Dependent on China for tea, and increasingly uncomfortable with that dependency, the British began to search for an alternative. Could they grow their own tea somewhere within their own vast empire? The answer came from an unlikely place. In 1823, a Scottish adventurer named Robert Bruce was traveling through the Assam region of northeastern India when he encountered local tribes using leaves from a wild plant to make a traditional drink. He brought samples back. They were analyzed.
They were identified as a previously unknown variety of the Camellia sinensis plant, the same species as the Chinese tea plant, but different enough to be classified as its own subspecies, Camellia sinensis var. Assamica. Tea was growing wild in India. It had been growing there all along. The British moved quickly. Tea plantations called tea gardens or tea estates were established across Assam and then in Darjeeling in the foothills of the Himalayas and eventually in Nilgiri in southern India and in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The conditions in Assam were ideal. The climate was warm and humid, the soil was rich, and the Assamica variety produced large, bold leaves with a strong malty flavor that would become the foundation of the strong black teas that Britain preferred. These tea plantations were built using a labor system that, while not slavery in the legal sense, relied heavily on indentured laborers brought from other parts of India under conditions that were often harsh and exploitative. The workers, many of whom were from tribal communities, were bound by contracts they could not easily leave, paid very low wages, and housed in basic plantation housing. By the late 19th century, Indian tea had largely displaced Chinese tea in the British market, and Indian teas, particularly Assam and Darjeeling, had developed their own distinctive characters and passionate followings. Darjeeling tea, grown at high altitude in cool, misty conditions, is often called the champagne of teas for its delicate floral muscatel flavor. It is one of the most prized teas in the world and granted geographical indication status, meaning that only tea grown in Darjeeling may be legally called Darjeeling tea, similar to the rules governing French champagne.
This brings us to something that surprises many people. Every type of tea, green, black, white, oolong, or pu'er, comes from the same plant, the Camellia sinensis. The differences between them are not about different plants, they are entirely about how the leaves are processed after picking. Green tea is the least processed. After picking, the leaves are quickly heated, either steamed, as in Japan, or pan-fired, as in China, to stop oxidation. This preserves the green color and the fresh, vegetal, sometimes grassy flavor. Chinese green teas like Longjin, Dragonwell, and Japanese green teas like Sencha and Gyokuro are some of the most refined and studied teas in the world. Green tea is the oldest processed form of tea. What Lu Yu was writing about in the Tang Dynasty was essentially a form of green tea. White tea is even less processed. The youngest leaves and buds are simply picked and dried with minimal human intervention. The resulting tea is pale, delicate, and subtly sweet. White tea was historically reserved for Chinese emperors. Silver needle and white peony are the most famous varieties. Oolong tea sits between green and black, partially oxidized, with a flavor spectrum that ranges from fresh and floral to rich and roasted, depending on the degree of oxidation. The great oolong teas of Taiwan, particularly those from the Alishan Mountains and those of Fujian Province in China, such as Tieguanyin, are considered among the most complex and nuanced teas in the world. Black tea is fully oxidized. The leaves are withered, rolled, fully oxidized, and dried. This process turns them dark and creates the bold, robust flavors associated with Assam, Darjeeling, Ceylon, and the classic English breakfast tea that has become a global morning staple. Compared to green tea, black tea was better suited for long ocean voyages. The full oxidation process made it more stable and less likely to spoil during months-long sea journeys, which is one reason it became the dominant type of tea traded by the West. Pu'er tea is in a category of its own. Produced primarily in Yunnan, China, pu'er is fermented, sometimes for decades. The flavors are earthy, deep, and complex. Good aged pu'er is extraordinarily expensive, and certain vintage cakes are traded among collectors like fine wine or rare whiskey. A particularly prized aged pu'er cake can sell for tens of thousands of dollars. And then there is herbal tea,
though strictly speaking, it is not tea at all. Chamomile, peppermint, robios, hibiscus, these are tisanes, infusions made from plants other than Camellia sinensis. They have their own long histories and medicinal traditions, but they are not technically tea. As tea spread across the globe, each culture shaped it into something slightly different. In Morocco, tea became a ceremony of hospitality. Chinese gunpowder green tea, brewed with fresh mint leaves and a great deal of sugar, poured from a great height to create a froth and served to guests 3 times. To refuse the first cup is considered rude. The mint tea of Morocco is as much a social ritual as the Japanese tea ceremony, just louder, sweeter, and more communal.
In India, tea was adopted so completely that it became inseparable from daily life. But it was transformed. Strong black tea brewed with milk, water, sugar, and a blend of spices, cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, became masala chai. The word chai simply means tea in Hindi, itself derived from the Chinese word cha. When Westerners order a chai tea latte, they are technically ordering a tea latte, a small linguistic redundancy that tea scholars note with gentle amusement. Chai is drunk from small glasses on nearly every street corner in India, sold by chaiwalas whose calls echo through markets and railway stations. In Russia and Iran, tea is brewed very strong in a small pot, a samovar or teapot, and then diluted to taste in the cup, sometimes drunk through a lump of sugar held between the teeth. The samovar, a large heated urn used to keep water hot, became an icon of Russian domestic life. Tea arrived in Russia via caravan routes from China in the 17th century and became deeply embedded in Russian culture by the 19th. In the American South, tea took on a very different form, iced, sweetened, and brewed strong. Sweet tea is a defining element of Southern American food culture, less a beverage and more an institution. The United States also gave the world the iced tea craze more broadly, which was said to have been popularized at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where a merchant named Richard Bletchenden began pouring his tea over ice when the summer heat made hot tea unappealing. Whether the story is fully accurate, iced tea spread rapidly across America and beyond. Today, tea is grown in more than 50 countries. The largest producers are China, India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. Global tea production exceeds 6 billion kilograms per year. It is drunk in every country on Earth. The tea industry has changed enormously. The tea bag, invented around 1908 when American tea merchant Thomas Sullivan accidentally sent samples to clients in small silk pouches that they dunked directly into hot water, now accounts for the majority of tea sold in Western markets. The convenience it offered was simply too great to resist, even if it sacrificed some of the nuance of loose-leaf brewing. At the same time, a global revival of interest in artisanal, single-origin, and traditional teas has taken hold. Tea sommeliers and tea masters now exist the same way wine sommeliers do. Specialty tea shops have opened in cities around the world. Ancient tea traditions in Taiwan, Japan, and China have found new audiences. And meanwhile, matcha, the powdered green tea of the Japanese ceremony, has moved from the tea room to the cafe to the supermarket shelf. It appears in lattes and chocolates and ice cream and face masks, consumed by millions of people who may not know its 600-year-old history, but who have found in its deep green powder something they needed. Tea is still changing. It always has been. From the wild forests of Yunnan to the kitchen kettle, from the monastery to the coffee shop, from an emperor's courtyard to a tired person lying in bed tonight, listening to a quiet voice describe very slowly the long, gentle, extraordinary journey of a leaf and some hot water. And that is the history of tea. From a legend beneath a tree in ancient China, to the monasteries of Japan, to the trading ships of Europe, to the plantations of India, to the markets of Morocco and the railway stations of Mumbai, and the kitchens of almost every home on earth. 5,000 years, one plant, countless cups. Sleep well.